So I have less than 15 minutes to talk about the very intricate topic of simplification. That sounds a bit like a paradox, and it's also quite ironic because I will have to simplify quite a bit myself. So what's on the table? Last year, the United Nations have proclaimed Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods as champions of the earth, which are two vegan companies making imitation meat. And this is part of their larger message, larger campaign to cut back on meat. Now the thing is that both companies are not so much interested in cutting back on meat, they're actually interested in eliminating livestock altogether. So they have a very radical agenda by aiming to eliminate or making livestock obsolete by the year 2030, 2035. So you may think this is a crazy plan, and you may say also this is in the fringe, but have in mind that this is getting here endorsement by UN Environment and also receives a lot of money by several investment funds. And if you're still not convinced that this can just be brushed away, last month there was an announcement that 14 cities, among which major European cities, at least the mayors of those cities, have committed to achieve a planetary health diet by, again, 2030. Now, what does that mean? It is within the framework of C40 cities as an initiative, where the ambitious target would be to eliminate meat and dairy. The more flexible target would be to reduce the amount considerably to the level prescribed by the Eat Lancet Commission. So if people think that the Eat Lancet diet is dead after all the criticism, it is not, it is only starting. They are now reconfiguring their efforts within a consortium called FABLE, and they also have set up the so-called Global Commons Alliance, which has a big plan for a small planet. So they're quite ambitious. They have connections to all the major corporations. They're linked to fractions of the United Nations, and they're endorsed by governments. They have also endorsement by the World Economic Forum. So it is quite a gigantic initiative, so you will see more of this in the future. So if some people at least would, and I know this is a radical statement, but I'm pointing out the very extreme simplifications here. What is being proposed as an alternative for the food we're used to? Well, obviously Beyond Burgers get a thumb up, but also we would have to replace things like dairy and eggs. Eat Lancet allows you to have 1.5 eggs a week, basically. So what would you have to consume these kind of foods? You see here Gunhild Stordalen, which is the founder of Eat, proposing a vegan cheese. And these are some products that are put on the market by companies often in the sphere of the Commission. And what you see there are products that proclaim to be plant-based, but there are not a lot of plants to be seen, certainly no vegetables. What you will find are extracts, starches, refined oils, and loads of additives to put them into a kind of concoction. So what you have here is a very postmodern approach to food, I would say. So how are you going to ever convince the public to go that way? Well, the only thing you can do is either try to enforce certain things by hard policy interventions or by using clever marketing. And clever marketing always comes with slogans, and many slogans you will find are along those lines. Cut your carbon footprint in half by going vegetarian, or this one by, remarkably, a tweet by Oxford University. A vegan diet is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth. Now, I find that quite astonishing, because as a scientist, I'm trained to look at context and contextual factors, and clearly these things are overstating, to an extreme degree, certain messages. So let's just look at one of the elements. I know this is a wide debate, and we cannot go into everything, but if you just look at footprints, as in the previous slogans, you would have a random Western European individual having a certain typical footprint, let's say, of 12 tons of CO2 equivalents. And you could break that down into different categories. Now, if you change your diet into a plant-based option, you will indeed halve your contribution, basically, but that will be within the dietary compartment. Now, if you look at your total footprint, you will change in the order of something between 2 and 6 if you're either flexitarian or a hardcore vegan. If you take into account rebound effects, there may be even 1 to 3%. So in other words, this is something, you do change something, but you have to put that in a wider perspective on your total emissions and include your lifestyle factors. That includes also, of course, the way you have transportation, your cars you take, the cars you buy, the cars you use, the flights you take. Now, talking about cars and flights, this is a message from last month from Oprah. so the famous TV host, and it's one of those typical celebrities that come up with those one-liners. So she says to her fans that basically if you change your dietary pattern, you go one vegan meal a day, that would be equivalent from driving all across the United States. So I don't know how exactly you have to interpret this, but it is a bold statement. And interestingly, earlier this month, there was a paper that calculated emissions by celebrities, and Oprah was included, and her travel output, just for the flight she takes, is about 40 times the average emission the total emission of an average American. So the impact it would have on her diet is completely negligible. And you can say this is an extreme case, it's an individual choice, and what you have to do is to look at the total population and see what the United States would perform like if they would go altogether vegan. Well, we know the answer to that more or less because we have this paper that many of you probably have seen from Robin White and Mary Beth Hall, where they have calculated that if the whole of the US would go without livestock, well, you would drop by 2.6%. Again, that is something, and it's in the same order of magnitude as individual changes, but it is not moving the needle all that much. And worse, you would end up with certain deficiencies in essential nutrients if you produce your food in that way. And that's pretty normal in the end because US livestock is about 4% of the total emissions, which is basically very small compared to the elephant in the room, which is fossil fuels. Let's keep those. Right. So why are we blaming the cows? Well, I'm not saying that nothing is wrong with the way we're producing livestock, don't get me wrong, but statements like cows are worse than cars are completely absurd for several reasons. And they derive mostly from this comparison that has been made based on FAO data, where people compared life cycle analysis with direct emissions. You may know the story, which is an unfair comparison. If you compare apples to apples, of course, cows are not worse than cars. Also, 14.5% contribution is a global number. It's a number for the planet. It overlooks context. There's a huge diversity. You cannot compare a Western European system with what happens in India, for instance. So you would have to take into account all those heterogeneities and nuances. This I can skip because we've seen it in the excellent presentation before. So you have to, if you lump everything in one CO2 equivalent metrics, you again overlook quite a bit of complexity. And the fact that you have these natural cycles versus putting fossil fuels, which were for millions of years in the soil, you're putting them in the atmosphere, and they're going to stay there. You have to take into account carbon sequestration. And I know this is very much dependent on the practice you're having. But if you look at the work of Jason Roundtree and colleagues, for instance, you can get remarkable results. And these options should be considered, as should agroforestry, indeed. And this is a very important one. I want to focus on the last one of these contextual aspects here. It's a statement by Adam Drnovsky, where he says that maybe we should look better at the cost of individual foods if we start comparing them, because we are overlooking something very important, namely nutritional value. Usually these comparisons are expressed on CO2 equivalents per gram, per kilocal. Now that is not what we are facing as a challenge. The challenges for this world, for mid-century, are not carbohydrates or kilocalories or amounts of food, but quality protein and a whole range of micronutrients which will deliver in the best way to animal source foods. It includes B12, zinc, iron. And even if you express them per protein, which you sometimes see, usually protein quality is overlooked. If you take into account the best estimates for protein quality, including digestibility, and also, of course, the essential amino acids, you get a completely different perspective. And many legumes that can claim, according to the rough calculations, that they're good protein sources, can no longer do so if you take into account the state-of-the-art calculations. And what you see on this graph is a list of countries, from the left to the right, in increasing amounts of animal foods in the diet. Right? And what you have on the left, the dots you see there are stunting. Stunting within infant populations and very young children. And what you see is, of course, that the countries that have the least animal foods have the most stunting. Now, what I find worrying is that the line that I've drawn there, the red line, is a suggestion of Eat Lancet. That's where they want to put the limit. So basically, they're proposing animal food levels that are corresponding with developing countries that have the highest level of study. I find that very concerning and very worrying, especially because we know that interventions with animal source foods in such countries provide so much potential for improvement. So the argument I sometimes make is that livestock is used as a scapegoat. It always has been, by the way, historically, but it is a very convenient way for several people to ignore many complexities and many other aspects of our life that we rather not deal with. And that counts for us as individuals, thinking about our lifestyles, but also for, of course, all kinds of vested interests. I found this one on a page of an oil federation, suggesting that eating meat is worse than burning oil. That's completely amazing. And as a final takeaway, I would just like to project this here. This is our historical diet. And I find it absolutely irresponsible to try to condense the challenges we face to a binary thinking scheme. Not all of us do, unfortunately, but mainstream ideas often do, and policymakers sometimes do also, where everything that is wrong about environment or health comes down to a division that looks like this, which is basically the plant-animal divide. Now, there are things to be fixed from both sides of the divide. And thinking in this way will just make us overlook the real challenges. And there are real challenges. If we cut somewhere, we could cut there, for instance. That would be a better idea. And there are challenges, and they're urgent, and we should address them. That includes livestock, but let's do it, please, with the best of possible science. Thank you.
Hello again. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'd just like to underline an aspect. You talked about context. And at this figure, which has had so much impact of livestock's long shadow, we now also know, you probably just didn't have time to mention it, there was specifically, there was a very strong methodological mistake in how deforestation was accounted for, so that in itself would reduce it. Yep. And I also want to bring deforestation into the fore, just to have it said here today. Of course, I think many people know, and you certainly know it, but John Lynch has already mentioned that the issues of land use change is being more important than methane, and that was the case in that wrong calculation of livestock's long shadow. And especially since here we are a European audience, it's very important to really underline here today that when we are producing animal products in Europe, we are avoiding that they're imported from elsewhere, where they will be creating deforestation. I think this is a point that has to be absolutely underlined when we are in the European context of European policy.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with both points, yes, exactly.
I have a very simple question and a comment. The comment goes to what you just said, sir. Obviously, we import a lot of nitrogen in the form of soy, for example, from Brazil, to feed our poultry and our pigs, our monogastrics. And so that does contribute to deforestation. European meat industry can contribute to deforestation. It's not black and white. The question is a very simple one. This is a brilliant presentation. I love it. I want to use all of your graphs in my own presentations. Can we have a copy?
Of course. Certainly. Thank you.